Well, good evening, everyone. I am going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Rachel Johnson, and I am a member of the public programs team here at Crystal Bridges. First, I'm going to start with our Indigenous Peoples Acknowledgement. At Crystal Bridges in the Momentary, we recognize our role as settlers and guests in the Northwest Arkansas region. We acknowledge the Caddo, Quapaw, and Osage, as well as the many Indigenous caretakers of this land and water. We appreciate the enduring influence of the vibrant, diverse, and contemporary cultures of Indigenous peoples. We're conscious of the role colonization that museums have played. As cultural institutions, we have a responsibility to engage in the dismantling of historical and systemic invisibility of Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future. We choose to intentionally hold ourselves accountable to appropriate conversation, representation, connection, and education to facilitate a space of measurable change. I would also like to thank all of our sponsors listed here of learning and engagement programming for We the People, the radical notion of democracy. Thank you for coming to Critical Conversations, Preparing Young Americans for Citizenship with the Clinton Presidential Center. I am pleased to welcome and introduce our panelists. Our moderator is Dr. Jay Barth of the William J. Clinton Presidential Library and Museum. Joining him are panelists Justin Driver, Robert R. Slaughter, Professor of Law and Counselor to the Dean at Yale Law School, Fernanda Rain, founder of the History CoLab, Shannon Salter, educator, and Wesley Hedgepeth, educator and president-elect of the National Council for Social Studies. If you need closed captioning, and I'm sorry that I didn't mention this before introducing everyone, please click Show Captions or the CC button that you should see at the bottom of your screen. There's also a Q&A tab. If you would like to put any questions in there, we will be keeping an eye on it throughout the talk. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jay.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel, and welcome everyone to this conversation tonight. The three entities that compose the Clinton Presidential Center, the Clinton Presidential Library, the Clinton Foundation, and the Clinton School of Public Service, we're all really thrilled to be partnering with Crystal Bridges on this conversation tonight, and I'm super happy that my colleagues are here for the conversation. We heard from Rachel everybody's name and brief title, but why don't we just get started with just having folks introduce themselves, just so people can begin getting used to the connection between a voice and a face. So Justin, you want to talk a little bit about your work?
Yeah, so thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Justin Driver. I teach constitutional law at Yale Law School, and I wrote a book on students' constitutional rights called The Schoolhouse Gate: Public Education, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for the American Mind. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Shannon?
Hi, thank you. So my name is Shannon Salter. I am an educator in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I am one of the founding social studies teachers of Building 21 High School, our public high school in Allentown. And most of my work has focused on helping use the skills of civic engagement to help students take their learning out of the classroom to make an impact in their community.
Awesome. Fernanda?
Thank you, Jay. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm a historian by training who used to work in Soviet diplomatic history, but transitioned into the world of being a social entrepreneur and a systems person, thinking about how do we change systems as a whole and how do we shift the course of history bend the arc of history toward justice. And in that capacity, I started the History CoLab as a catalyst of collaboration among institutions and different silos to improve the experience of history learning for young people so that everyone can grow up inspired and engaged as a citizen of democracy. So that's me.
Wonderful. And finally, Wesley?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Jay. I am Wesley Hedgepeth. I teach high school politics and history in Richmond, Virginia. I am the past president of the Virginia Council for the Social Studies and am currently the president-elect of the National Council for the Social Studies. Part of my expertise and work has been in civil dialogue and civic engagement in the classroom and outside of the classroom. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, Justin, as you said in your introduction, Obviously, this is an area, the free expression rights of students, and a crucial area for you and your research, and your book is truly fantastic. And I want to give kudos to it and recommend it. But to tie back to the exhibit that this conversation is really tied to, the We the People exhibit at Crystal Bridges, could you talk just a little bit about kind of where we stand with student free expression rights based on key Supreme Court precedent?
Sure. Thanks for that those kind words about my book. I'll give you just a quick thumbnail sketch of where student free expression is these days, including thinking about its origins. The foundational case in this area is one from the 1960s called Tinker versus Des Moines, where students wish to wear black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. And school administrators get wind of this and they say, oh no, that's too hot of a topic. You know, we have students who have died over in Vietnam, and if you wear these black armbands, there's going to be just a tremendous amount of unrest. And it's an open question at the time as to whether students have the ability to voice their ideas, even on as central a topic as America's engagement in the Vietnam War. And the Supreme Court, in a really important opinion, one that in my view didn't quite go far enough, says, and this gives me the title for my book, it can hardly be argued that students shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. And what is really helpful about that opinion is that Justice Fortas says, you know, when students exchange ideas on a topic, that is not a distraction from education, but instead is a vital part of the educational process itself. So that was a really a high watermark for students' constitutional rights. And since then, it has been, you know, sort of several decades of decline. There was a case involving a student called Matthew Frazier, who delivered a lewd speech, and the Supreme Court said it was permissible to punish the student for offering a speech that's laden with sexual innuendo. There was another case involving a school newspaper called Hazelwood versus Kuhlmeyer, and there the Supreme Court said that it was in effect permissible for the school to control its own speech and to prevent student journalists from publishing what they wanted. And then there was a case that was decided in 2007 called Bong Hits for Jesus. That case was decided when I was a law clerk at the Supreme Court. That's what we law clerks called it. The formal name is Morse versus Frederick, but nobody calls it that. Everybody instead calls it Bong Hits for Jesus. Very interesting facts that I won't get into here, but Chief Justice Roberts in 2007 writes this opinion for the court where he says that it's permissible to punish students for speech that a principal reasonably believes is designed to promote illicit drug use. It's a very unusual opinion from a First Amendment perspective, because typically you're not allowed to silence one side of the debate without silencing the other side. And here, anti-drug speech is permissible, but pro-drug speech is forbidden. And that is a case that has aged very badly in the sense that there's been a transformation with respect to laws regarding marijuana in our society. And you can understand the young man in question is trying to promote his ideas about the changing legal landscape when it comes to marijuana. The last case, the most recent one, is a happier one for those of us who like the idea of students having some expansive free speech rights. There was a case that was decided last year involving a student called Brandy Levy. We might regard this as the curious case of the vulgar cheerleader, who she uttered some vulgarities off campus on a Saturday afternoon at a local convenience store. And she did so on Snapchat with the expectation that the message would disappear. And school officials got wind of this after she denounced being cut from the cheerleading squad using the F word. And she was sort of suspended from the junior varsity cheerleading squad for a year. And the question is, well, can the school punish her in this fashion? The court, in a wonderful opinion, at least with respect to its holding by my old boss, Justice Breyer, he says that the school overstepped its bounds here. And he had a really nice phrase. He said, America's public schools are nurseries of democracy, suggesting that schools should be invested in students exchanging their ideas. The opinion could have gone farther still, in my view, but it was the first time that a student had prevailed on a free speech case since Tinker back in the 1960s. So we should tip our hat, I believe, to Justice Breyer. So that's just a little capsule summary.
Wonderful. Thank you, Justin. So obviously this conversation tonight is about how do we best prepare students for engaging in that democracy. And Shannon, you're working with students every day in school. How important do you think expansive free speech rights, free expression rights are for students as a mode of preparing students for citizenship?
Honestly, Jay, I have a hard time thinking of something more important than teaching students to raise their voice, to not be afraid of raised voices, to interact with raised voices. I'll go with another justice, Justice Brandeis, who counseled us that when we encounter speech that makes us uncomfortable, that makes us scared, that makes us confused, or even makes us offended, the solution is not enforcing silence, but rather the solution is more speech, right? That is how you address these things. And by imposing silence instead, we rob students of the ability to practice the very civil discourse that we can observe lacking in our adult civic life. If we don't practice it, it's not going to happen when we're adults. And so it is really important that as much as possible, to the furthest extent possible, we use more speech to address those situations that make us uncomfortable, that make us feel insecure about ourselves. And as solutions in the classroom, more speech, more speech, more speech is the most important way to help our students practice to then not be afraid to raise their voice once they're adults and they're in our communities and they're meant to be the problem solvers in our communities and the idea makers in our communities and the advocates in our communities. If we disable their voices before they can even enter that community, then how is anyone ever going to use them? So honestly, that's how important it is. It's the very basis of a productive and healthy functioning civil society.
So Wesley, I mean, how do we balance that? What Shannon, I think, very beautifully talked about in terms of this ideal with the basic practice of education in some orderly way, so that all students really are able to gain knowledge in this environment. How do you balance those things?
Yeah, Jay, I couldn't agree more with what Shannon said, that schools need to be a safe place for student self-exploration. And we need, as educators, to provide them that space with the guardrails, with that foundation that will provide them the skills that we're teaching them, the background content knowledge that they need, and of course giving them the practice on how to find that. Certainly, we could talk about pedagogical strategies for research, for discerning what material they're looking at and evaluating resources. But students really have to be able to practice. And one way that we could do that is giving them agency within the school building. Another way we could do that is modeling it ourselves as educators, showing students how we take information that we are concerned about or things that we're concerned about, how we redress our concerns. It could include student representation in governing decisions. Student councils are a great way to again model the safety of democracy within a safe environment, like the school classroom.
Fernanda, anything to add there?
I have a quick thought on that, just to build on what the other speakers have said, agreeing with them wholeheartedly, with an additional perspective coming from a high school background in Germany, where free speech was extraordinarily important, yet with very strong guardrails, knowing that if we don't have a core commitment to constitutional democratic values and the respect of human dignity, that democracy can go off can go off the rails, right? And terrible things can happen. So there was a lot of empowerment, a lot of freedom for students, a lot of space to take ownership and agency, but there was zero tolerance for hate speech, zero tolerance for zero tolerance for intolerance, I guess. It was just yes to open the floor to have conversations, but never to attack the fundamental dignity of the other human being. So I think that is something, the fragility of democracy is not something that we live with, or we haven't grown up living with. It's now more present today than I think it's been in a very long time. But understanding how this question of student agency is so core to building a culture of respect and of discourse between human beings that recognize that regardless of our standpoint, we are part of a community that is not only local and national, but also international and global, that just requires a degree of respect that is that has to be reflected in the words that we use.
If I may just amplify some things that my colleagues have said, I completely agree that it's especially important for schools to honor students' constitutional rights. It seems to me that the public school for most young people is the first sustained exposure that they have to a governmental entity. And if that governmental entity is oppressing them and prohibiting them from being able to express themselves, then students are going to draw very negative lessons about what it means to live in the United States of America. And the Supreme Court itself has said that the constitutional rights of students are paramount. There's a wonderful opinion from 1943 called West Virginia versus Barnett, where schools were expelling students for refusing to pledge allegiance to the United States of America. Jehovah's Witnesses found that it conflicted with their free exercise rights. And so schools all around the country are expelling students. And Justice Jackson writes a wonderful opinion for the court where he says that if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox. And he says, if we don't honor constitutional rights in the school, then it teaches young people to discount our constitutional protections as mere platitudes, right? This is just cheap talk, and they don't really mean it. And I think that Justice Jackson was exactly right.
So we're going to come back in a bit to some of the kind of current attacks on some of free expression in schools. But before we do that, I want to talk a bit about curricular reform and some of the initiatives that a lot of folks on this panel have worked on in terms of how we need to change the way that civics education takes place in the schools. And Fernanda, can you kind of get us started in this in terms of some of your thinking about what would be the ideal curriculum and other aspects of civics education?
Happy to, and I think the ideal curriculum question is one that I don't know whether I can elegantly dodge it. I'm not sure there is an ideal curricular content. I think that's what the conversation has been very focused on, is what is in the package that we put into the funnel on the kids' heads, right? Like what's the content that's in there? And for me, the curricular reform conversation is as much about reforming school overall to say what matters in school, who does the teaching, right? And how do we structure time so that kids can learn in a way that works? So dismantling the Carnegie unit and restructuring school units of time so that kids can actually do the kind of learning that is deep and meaningful. That is absolutely critical. Orienting the entire system toward the kinds of outcomes that matter, like you could call it having a civic readiness measure overall, but it's basically, in the end, it's the core competencies that have been identified already as 21st century skills that are the core civic skills, right? It's collaboration, critical thinking, communication, citizenship, and creativity. That's what we do in social studies. And that's what we do with history. And actually, there's no subject that does it better than us. And we're not in that conversation saying, we are it. If you want that for your kids, do more history and civics, because you're not going to get those outcomes that you say you need for 21st century employees unless you teach them the kind of things they need. Right? So in some ways, curricular reform is, or the shift in conversation, I think really has to be around the why. Like, why are we doing this? So that our young people have the skills and mindsets so that they can succeed. And then making sure that the transcript we have and the outcomes we measure are geared toward that. And I know the Carnegie Foundation and a number of other big, research institutions are geared toward exactly that and moving toward that. And making sure we insert ourselves as the social studies world in that to anchor the civic understanding in that is key. Again, making sure we have time for project-based learning, for the kind of hands-on action learning that we know works for kids, and then making sure that it's anchored in the community. There's wonderful new research that came out of Brookings and out of the Christensen Institute about the critical importance of community-based, relationship-based learning for equity. We know how to do that. That's learning this stuff in museums like yours, in archives, in libraries, in places that matter to kids that they walk by every day, claiming it as their own through projects in which they learn how to have a voice and how to participate. That's breaking down the walls of the classroom, bringing it into the school, allowing kids to have a voice and act and learn in their communities. That, for me, is the biggest question for curricular reform. And not so much the focus on whether we're going to add the Korean War or not, right? I mean, we can argue about that till kingdom come, but I think it's a distraction from the core issue, which is that the curriculum for the 21st century for young people in any democracy has to be building the skills that they need to feel safe, to feel oriented, to feel empowered, to feel seen, to feel a sense of belonging. All that stuff is what makes them ready to be a citizen. And if we don't focus on that, we're going to just lose ground.
So Shannon, I know you've been teaching in a school that has attempted to kind of create some of those elements that Dr. Rain was just talking about. Could you talk a little bit more about your experience and whether you feel like that is truly feasible in a way that goes across schools outside of a more specialized case like yours?
No, absolutely. And in fact, I'm in the process of now translating what we've learned in the school I've been working in for the past year across our very large district and the other schools in the district, as well as sharing what we've done with schools across the country. And that is that curriculum should not be a trivial pursuit looking list of things that you check off. I know this date, I know this event, I know this battle, I know this name, I can name the capitals of the cities, things that frankly, I only need this for that now. But rather refocusing, defining curriculum as a list of skills that you master within content, so that you can then use what you find on this smartphone in an effective way. And when we're talking about social studies, for example, it is all about the practices and skills and dispositions of civic engagement. Are we giving you the tools? So where in years past, the social studies may have been defined by history and actually seen as a synonym for history, right? What is social studies? It's history class. Instead, translating that into the class that teaches you, among other things, how do you use and apply history to the events you see around you to give you a toolbox to take out in the world so that you can be effective at citizenship. So, practicing constitutional democracy in the classroom community, just like Wesley referred to earlier, conducting effective inquiry, balancing diverse and disagreeing points of view and arriving at answers to essential questions, fostering those courageous conversations that you're going to need out in the real world, first in that safer space of a classroom where you can try and fail. And honestly, it's not as radical as it might have seemed before. I mean, state standards are heading in that direction. The NCSS C3 framework, which is the basis for social studies curriculum in so many places now, definitely advocates for a skills-based and not a content checklist-based list for learning objectives. Where I teach in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania social studies standards within the past decade have migrated to a skills-based way of assessing performance in social studies. Instead of, did you teach George Washington? Did you get to Teapot Dome? Did you teach the Korean War? We don't define student learning objectives that way any longer. And we don't measure student learning that way. It's what can you do with whichever of those pieces of historical content we've curated that might inform your developing ideology on the world you see in front of you today. And for those events that we didn't teach you in class, if we left out the Korean War, the fact is that we're teaching you the critical thinking skills so that if it comes up in your adult life, you know how to seek that information, how to evaluate whether the sources of information are reliable, and you can integrate it into your mindset, into your ideology successfully without a teacher having to pour it into your brain and you receive it like a passive bucket. It absolutely is not just doable, it is important we do it that way.
So Justin, I know you've thought a lot about these issues of what our civics education looks like in the United States. Could you talk a little bit about your views on that?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I do here in New Haven is I have the honor of being a faculty advisor for a program that takes Yale Law students and puts them in New Haven public schools with an eye toward helping to promote civic education. And one of the things that the students do there is learn about students' constitutional rights. And that's valuable, I think, because many young people, and I certainly would have put myself in this bucket as a young person, would have had real difficulty understanding in a deep way, or even a superficial way for that matter, giving my old self too much credit, the separation of powers and these sort of abstract ideas, those would have been, that are important to the Constitution, those would have been too far removed from my own experiences. And so I think that asking students how they think about students' constitutional rights and understanding how jurists have interacted with students' constitutional rights can be a wonderful gateway for thinking about some of these larger constitutional concepts. One virtue of talking about students' constitutional rights is that, contrary to popular perception, it's not true that sort of students always want to side for greater students' rights. In fact, in many of my experiences, I've found that they want the school to sort of drop the hammer on the students and everything, right? And you have to make an effort to say, well, here's why it might be a good idea for students to have some measure of constitutional protection. But it's also a good mechanism for getting students off of their feet so that they can actively sort of get up and make a mock oral argument about the strongest case for this position, and encouraging them to maybe sometimes take a position that they disagree with, actually, right? And allowing them to try another idea on for size. It seems to me that that is a valuable part of the sort of civil disagreement that is all too absent from American society today. I don't purport to believe that students' constitutional rights should be the only thing that is studied in civic education. That would be an immodest claim, but I do think that that can be an important part of thinking about our constitutional order and American society more broadly.
Awesome. So Wesley, obviously I want to hear whatever thoughts you have about how the classroom experience might be changed in a more positive and favorable way. But I'd also like you to begin to think about, how we move beyond the classroom and how we really take these ideals of civic education kind of beyond that room and those state standards and that curriculum.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Yeah, I think it's really important that students practice being engaged in civics, and those that are practicing this in high school are much more likely to do it again throughout their lifetime. In fact, the preparation for civics was the primary purpose of establishing public schools, in fact, right? So the fact that, students are more likely to vote, they're more likely to volunteer, they're more likely to communicate with their elected officials if they are practicing civics and learning civics in schools. Public-private partnerships with businesses, with government officials, with nonprofits really need to be encouraged. And these partnerships ought to be diverse, fully representative of the student body and the locale in which the students live. State departments of education and local school systems could use what we already have as an existing framework, like the diploma seals for civic readiness. These seals create a framework for student civic engagement, both in and outside of the classroom. Currently, there are at least 8 states and many localities that independently offer it with variety of requirements, such as completion of course history, U.S. history and U.S. government coursework, service learning and community service hour requirements, participation in extracurriculars like JROTC, Model United Nations, county government, county model Congress, those things, and then also a completion of a capstone project. NCSS actually created a toolkit for those who are seeking to advocate for this diploma seal in the state or locality that you reside. I'm actually pretty proud that Virginia was the first one to offer of any kind. And actually, NCSS does not advocate for one type of seal. Of course, recognizing that they're different. In fact, in Tennessee, the governor offers a seal to entire schools or entire school districts for recognition of their excellence in civic education. Colleges and universities might use this seal on the diploma in the college admissions process. Employers might use this in the hiring process. Those are some of, that's one way to look at certainly bringing the kids outside of the classroom and practicing civics.
That's great. Shannon, you want to pop in?
Yeah, I just want to jump in because that brings me to another thing that we haven't talked about when it comes to curricular reform. We're all used to hearing about literacy across the curriculum, reading across the curriculum. Everyone's a reading teacher. The fact is that we all need to be civic educators as well, and elevating the skills of civics and the practice of civic education beyond the social studies classroom across the curriculum as well. And I'll share an example from our own school, because on Monday we're having a big celebration at my school, a nice flag raising ceremony. Our school has been recognized by the Arbor Day Foundation as a national tree campus. And this came out of a collaboration between our social studies teachers and our science teachers in the environmental science course, where students first learned the environmental science, but then spent time with their social studies teacher learning how science can be the foundation for policy development and community decision making. And students at the end of that experience proposed new tree plantings around our property to stakeholders in the community, including the city's Shade Tree Commission, Department of Public Works, the county's Conservation District, chief arborists from PPL, that's our utility company. And the most successful students project was funded by the community. The trees showed up, we got in the dirt, we planted them. And so students learned by engaging in civic action how to take the learning out of their science classroom into the community and literally change the landscape of the city of Allentown. And so these are things that can engage, especially those students who might come to you with the mindset of, oh, but I'm not a social studies person, or, oh, I'm not really interested in this, I'm interested in something else. But civics connects all learning to the outside world. There's not a class you can engage in that doesn't have the opportunity to engage in civic impact, whether it's the art teacher creating a mural project that is the foundation for community building and unifying a community. There's so many ways it can be done. So another curricular mindset change that has to happen is that civics only belongs in the social studies classroom.
And I'd also add that it only belongs in high school, that we're thinking about across the grade bands as well. Fernanda, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, exactly. And just to that point, that it really, what civics is about is unlocking that passion for lifelong learning, right? Like, we're trying to turn young people, for a democracy relies on lifelong learners. If you have people that think they're done at 18 or 16 or whatever, we can't function, because we're not static. So in order for democracy to work, we have to have people who know how to stay curious, to stay as learners, to get excited about creating, to get excited about collaborating and learning together. And that's the key, right? And there's so much wonderful research that's been done around these sort of principles of what kind of learning works, right? Learning through play, learning that's joyful and engaging and socially interactive and meaningful, and sort of that it bakes in those iterative loops, right? Where they get to see, this is what learning is actually about. That, whether it's in science or social studies or gym or whatever, that's in the end the core of democratic education, which, people think of civics as this, like, the three branches of government and a narrow little curriculum, but rebranding civics as sort of democratic education and saying that we as civics, we just try to fuel that and show the cross connections. That's kind of what we do, because it's way more than just the three branches of government. It's making sure that you always understand how to use those three branches at any given time, and that you always have to know more to make a decision, because you're going to have to vote. And you can't vote unless you've learned about what's going on. And it's complicated to be in a democracy. It's much easier to be in an autocracy. You can turn off your brain. You can just not vote, or you can just vote for the same guy. But democracy is hard, but the alternative sucks. And that, I guess, is sort of the lesson that you want kids to have. Yeah, I get it. It's hard to be in a democracy, but I know the cost is worth it.
So one of the things that I think a lot of folks who are concerned about civics education in the United States point to as a real challenge is the preparation of teachers to engage in this new way of doing civics education. And so, Shannon, could you talk just a little bit about what we need to do to better prepare teachers, give them more capacity to carry out this important work?
Wow, yeah, that's the big work in front of us, isn't it? It's that old horrible chestnut, those that can't teach, can't be true when it comes to civic engagement in the classroom. Teachers need to be able to bring what they know about civic life and their participation in it, becoming advocates so that civic life happens and is replicated with authenticity in their classroom. But that takes preparation and support. It takes an investment in getting teachers the practice they need. Teacher prep programs and the places that produce teachers need to start talking about this role and giving teachers the opportunity to practice it. And then once in the building, teachers also need to participate in civic life with freedom of speech and agency to participate in decisions. And when we talk about what are students doing on student government and how authentic is their voice in the community, well, how authentic is teacher voice in the community? And are we allowing them to both practice it and model it for the students who are watching them? So those things are really very important, and allowing those conversations between teachers and students where they share their roles in the community and how in those roles they have agency to advocate for change and to raise their voices. And that takes a community, an administration, a school board that supports teachers in doing those things. Because if students also see, Justin talked about what happens when students are sort of disengaged from our constitutional rights and values because they see it's been taken away from them in their first encounter with government. When they see teachers also having their agency taken away from them, not being allowed to practice those freedoms as well, it is another sort of nail in the coffin of students believing that we sincerely believe in those beliefs. So supporting teachers in practicing it and practicing it openly with their students and in front of their students is a really important thing we need to do to build teacher capacity to pull this off.
Great, thank you. And we're going to get to some of those teacher free expression rights in just a second. Wesley, any additional thoughts on how we need to do teacher preparation differently?
Yeah, teachers are lifelong learners too, and I can't agree more with what Shannon has said. That we need financial support. We need built-in time for regular, relevant, and research-informed professional development. Social studies teachers are fairly used to doing more and more with less and less. Let's be honest. And in fact, a recent report from NEA showed that teachers' salaries averaged almost 20% lower when compared to comparable workers with similar characteristics. This is made worse when we have to buy our own our classroom supplies out of our own pocket. But then, of course, when we are seeking to apply for professional development, funds are often denied. And then we're paying for that out of our pockets as well. So training and financial support is really important. The other thing that I must say, and is a broader conversation and kind of goes back to curricular changes, is that time has got to be afforded to social studies. The learning loss that we saw during the pandemic was great. However, previous to that, the NAEP assessment reported that only 23% of American 8th graders were proficient in civics. Since No Child Left Behind, 44% of districts, according to the CCSSO, reduced social studies time. The U.S. Department of Education School and Staffing Survey reported social studies time is only 10% of the total teaching time, whereas English is 53% and math is 25%. How are we preparing students and how are we giving teachers the time to do it without giving them the support that they need?
Great. Fernanda, did you have?
I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the big challenges there is to sort of call out some of the challenges that have caused this marketplace, right? If the No Child Left Behind, the second paragraph was, if students are not meeting the test scores, they can hire private companies to make sure their kids can get those test scores, which created an industry, the educational industrial complex, as it's been called, right, of testing, tutoring, and textbooks, right? That is all driven. You can imagine the consultant decks that were made. Hey guys, this is a $12 billion industry to make money on how do you get kids up their scores in English and math. And the ones that were being squeezed, not by a decision that was made rationally by policymakers, parents, students, people who understand kids. It's being made by an industry that saw an opportunity in the way a law was set up. And I think that is something where it's going to take the whole community to steer against that, right? Teachers need time to work with museums, to go and learn, see what's in my city. We do this all the time in Kansas City. Bringing museum educators and teachers together is magic. They make amazing things happen, and all they need is time. And then time and a little bit of money to then play with these ideas and bring it forward. It's not another tech platform. It's not another product. It's not another book that someone is hawking down. It's better than the last one. Forget about it. Just put the resources into the teachers, into the community, and reclaim the resources from the taxpayers who are getting their money put into stuff that is against children's better interests. Sorry, that's my soapbox on community-based learning and civics. I'm off. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you. So first off, I want to encourage folks to put their questions in the Q&A, because we are going to get to the questions of folks in the on the air tonight. So we'll go there after a few more questions that we have. Just I want to come back to you. We obviously talked about students' free expression rights earlier, but we also have, of course, the issue of teachers' free speech rights in the classroom and beyond. And could you kind of give us a little overview of the constitutional lay of the land when it comes to those issues?
Sure. This is a hot button topic right now. Obviously, there are lots of measures all across the country, anti-critical race theory measures that are written with an eye toward prohibiting teachers from addressing certain content. And, these are very important laws. I disdain those laws, I should say, just in order to avoid being misunderstood. Nevertheless, it's also important to note that traditionally, local school districts have enjoyed a great deal of autonomy to be able to decide what is determined. And courts have been fairly reluctant to get into regulating this sort of material. We saw some disputes along these lines in the 1980s involving particularly religious parents who thought that the school was attempting to secularize their children and wanted sort of carve-outs from the whole basic reader and things of that nature. And courts did not have much time for those claims. And many people would say, for similar reasons, that it would be an uphill battle to mount a legal challenge to anti-CRT legislation. One area that could be profitable for those who wish to dislodge the anti-CRT legislation would be to mount a challenge that lawyers would refer to as void for vagueness. This is the basic idea that if a statute's written in a way that is sufficiently nebulous, sufficiently vague, so that people do not know when they are violating the law, then it may be constitutionally suspect. Given the way that some of this legislation is written, you could imagine them being vulnerable to this. After all, some of the legislation, as I understand it, talks about not making people feel uncomfortable and things of that nature. And people feel uncomfortable for all sorts of different reasons. And talking about race and a history of racial oppression in the country may give rise to discomfort. But it's hard when the statute is predicated on how you make somebody else feel. There's sort of an irony there where many conservatives talk about the way that people on the left are too obsessed with feelings and everything, right? But in this instance, it seems to me that there's a real effort to preserve the feelings. The last thing I'll say is there's the leading case in this area. The area would be called public employee speech when we're thinking about public school students. Is a case called Garcetti versus Ceballos. That's a case from 15 years or so ago, the aughts. And it offered what many people would regard, certainly many public school teachers would regard as anemic protections for student speech. The basic idea is if you are speaking in your official capacity, then you have virtually non-existent free speech rights if those views are inconsistent with what the school district would have you say. So it was a very anemic conception of public employee speech rights. Interestingly, there was a case that was decided earlier this year out of the Supreme Court, which we know as the praying football coach. This is Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. And there, in an effort to vindicate Coach Kennedy's free exercise of religion rights, it sort of drew back on Garcetti versus Ceballos to say, well, he wasn't speaking in his official capacity. He was merely marching out after a football game to the 50-yard line in order to take a knee and pray, and that was a private act. I mean, my own view is that there are better places for privacy than the 50-yard line under the lights of a football game. But nevertheless, the court did say, well, Garcetti versus Ceballos shouldn't define the ambit of sort of official capacity too broadly. And that was, in my view, a misguided decision, but maybe that decision should be understood as providing some hope for those who wish to draw back on Garcetti versus Ceballos.
Thanks, excellent. Wesley, I'm going to pull in a question actually we've gotten online from State Senator Joyce Elliott, who talks about the attack on speech, including teacher speech by parents, movements, parents' rights movements, and others, and how this really undermines the ability to engage in comfortable speech in school. You're the president-elect of NCSS, so you obviously work with teachers around the country. How are the nation's teachers of civics kind of feeling about their work in this environment?
That's a great question. Jay, teachers are certainly confident professionals. However, I have to say the confidence has been shaken. Unfortunately, what's been mentioned earlier, Justin mentioned CRT. Unfortunately, a loud segment of our society doesn't trust or respect teachers. They've made that clear. And after 2+ years of pandemic school, teachers are a bit tired of that on top of it. We have been the subject of much undue criticism from groups with little expertise. We see censorship of books, teachers in Tennessee having to report their entire libraries and to their parents, and then of course going through a whole process of explaining why they're using certain books and telling students that they can't touch those books until they've been vetted. Having those there, and you have kids who are willing to read and wanting to read, and we'd say no because the bureaucracy says so. Of course, we are still, we have this greater diktat of what we can and cannot teach, such as critical race theory, even though that is not taught in the K-12 classroom. Teachers are telling, in some states, can't even say the word gay or recognize a trans student's identity without the permission of their parents, which is hugely problematic and dangerous for the students. So teachers are breaking, and so many are leaving the field that now the median experience of a teacher is 3 years. Used to be in the 1990s, that was 15 years of experience. So that's quite dramatic. So we're experiencing the effects of this lack of civics education and this lack of social studies education. Is it a coincidence that we're seeing a growing challenge to our country's democratic institutions when we continue to decrease our child's exposure to high quality social studies? Is it a coincidence that we're seeing more disinformation in our society when funding for social studies continues to trail that of all other disciplines that we've already mentioned? Despite this, we are teachers, and we're going to continue to spend long hours making our lessons, making sure that they're fun and they engage all students. We're going to continue to rise to the task of engaging large classes of diverse learners with diverse needs multiple times each day. We continue to do this while we're doing many other tasks with little time, support, and resources. And we're going to make personal sacrifices to make sure that our students' learning doesn't suffer. We'll do all of this despite the fact that, despite the challenges, because we love our students, our subject matter, and of course we have high hopes for civilization. So really, what teachers need, as mentioned before, we need more trust, we need more respect, we need more support.
Thank you. Shannon?
Yeah, if I could suggest, while it absolutely feels more intense right now and more immediate and more threatening right now, I imagine sometimes it feels the way that science teachers felt in the era of the Scopes monkey trial right now to be a social studies teacher, but it's not new and unprecedented for parents to be made uncomfortable by the fact that their students are ambassadors into their home, like nothing better than to come home and say, wow, I know something you don't know. You're wrong. My teacher taught me this new thing. And all of these conversations and this discomfort often starts with a parent, a grandparent, or someone raising their hand and saying, that's not what I was taught, or I didn't learn it that way. And that always creates discomfort, right? When we talk about the fact that schools need to get their students out into the community, it needs to be a two-way door. The community needs to come in as well. A lot more transparency and collaboration between educators and the community that they teach in is, I think, medicine for this. Removing the suspicion about what's happening in these closed doors that parents and families don't see in and don't participate in. And again, like I said, our only ambassador is a kid who really, really wants to make mom and dad feel bad and feel uncomfortable. We need to be those ambassadors ourselves. That also requires some investment in capacity building. A lot of teachers will tell you they're very comfortable talking to their students, not so comfortable talking to adults. We need to let those conversations happen more often. Again, more talking, not less talking, in order to build those bridges between community and classroom so that it removes the mystery, which creates fear about what is my kid learning and why is it different than what I learned. Because the different is what's making us better right now, but the unfamiliar is scary to people. And nobody likes to feel like they've had their ignorance or their lack of exposure to topics exposed, right? And so all of those things create this atmosphere where people feel defensive. And when they feel defensive, they start to make decisions informed by that defensiveness. So don't just get our learners out into the community to practice civic engagement, but invite our community in and engage with them through civic discourse, through the things we're talking about practicing, to remove some of these misperceptions about whatever voodoo it is that people think we're actually doing in our classroom, because 9/10 of it's just not true. And families could value it if they were allowed to see it.
Justin, Fernanda, either of y'all want to pop in? You good? So, Fernanda, I do want to move to you. You talked earlier about the role of museums, and I'd like us to talk a little bit about the role of supporting institutions like museums, like Crystal Bridges, like presidential libraries, where I work, in supporting schools in the work of civic education.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most exciting frontiers in education, really, is the sort of reimagining the role of the museum, not just as a sort of, I mean, they've always been civic institutions, right? But not just keepers of a story, right? Or keepers of stuff, but true partners in engaging the community and reflecting on the past and imagining a different future, because museums do both, right? They look backwards and they often look forwards, particularly art museums. We're always stepping into the way that artists, either the way they reimagined the world 100 years ago, or the way artists, contemporary artists, are challenging us to imagine a world that's different. So museums have this wonderful time scale that they're in and on, and we often visit them just thinking, oh, we're going to go look in a window on the past, but they're this invitation to engage in this four-dimensional way. And I think that is a key piece of how museums are thinking about it, or it will be relevant, very important for museums as they're trying to deepen their relevance in communities today, right? Moving beyond, many museums have a very colonial story, right? Like, we come from an industrial background where we had sort of whatever philanthropists. I love the stories of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the way that was set up, and all the stories that went into who was allowed to even give money to it, right? So that it wasn't, that it had the right kind of people participating in the storytelling. I mean, that's the past of museums, and the future of museums is one we're writing now. So I think, I mean, we coordinate this network of museums that is engaging very actively in reimagining civic education through the Educating for American Democracy project, right? Which is a federally a bipartisan effort that is being that was launched year and a half ago, and is really trying to shape a new conversation around history and civics as one that is inquiry based, focusing on questions and enabling people to dig into some of the big themes and the big challenges of American history. And in that context, we're working with a lot of museums. And the interesting thing is to see how eager museums are to be a part of that, and yet how big the delta is between they often are and what they already can do. So if you say, hey, museums, you know, how do you want to engage in have you done project-based learning before? And they're like, not really, but what are you thinking? And we're like, you know, would you be open to hosting a student project-based learning unit that they make an exhibit at your museum? And they're like, oh my God, what a great idea. Is that hard? And you're like, not really. This sounds sort of trite, right? But this is what it looks like on the ground when you're bringing museums often into conversations with schools. And the fun thing is to see how little it takes. Museums are brilliant at pivoting into this kind of work. It's like, one of my favorite examples is the Truman Library in Kansas City, that just has become this hub of project-based learning in Kansas City. And they'll do anything. They'll try anything. If the students say, hey, we want to create tours in your museum, they're like, okay, sounds great. Make tours. We'll PDF them and laminate them and that'll be great. Or if they say we want to make a public exhibit or make new art, they're like, that sounds fantastic. And they're, so having museums partner with schools very authentically in providing opportunities for young people to create, have a voice, exhibit their ideas, that I think is going to be a wonderful journey in the next years, to share between museums the learnings from those kind of projects, and enable teachers to see, hey, don't think of museums just as a field trip where you go for, take a day off or for edutainment. Museums are a site where you can activate neurons that you can't activate anywhere else, right? You can get kids to see the complexity of history. You can get kids to feel things in a way that's really different, to experience interactions with stuff, with things, with each other in a way that they can't in a classroom. So I think that's where I'm incredibly excited to see that conversation coming to life in the AAM, at the sort of larger structural level, the American Alliance of Museums, at the ASLH, of the local and state history societies. Like those, everywhere I look, there are museums saying, we want to be part of this transformation of learning. We want to be a part of a new kind of hands-on civics learning. And it's an invitation to join in, right? Both for teachers to explore how to use museums differently than they did before, and for museums to connect in with the school districts in a new way. So I think this is really the future of learning. Museums play an enormously important part, particularly with keeping things complex, right? Life is complicated and stories are complicated and they change, and museums are a great place to show that. A textbook never can tell that story.
Yeah, and I really want to applaud Crystal Bridges, especially how they've dealt with this exhibit and really expanded the conversation, not just tonight, but the variety of events that have taken place. And if folks haven't been able to see the exhibit, I really hope they get there. We do have several really good questions, and I want to get to those. One question relates to media literacy. I wonder if panelists could speak to the challenges and risks involved in teaching media literacy today, especially when it comes to political coverage. What content are they drawn to using in the classroom? What barriers are there to bringing that material into the classroom? So anybody who wants to go on media literacy. Shannon?
I'll start. Yeah, I will start, and I'm going to start by going all the way to as scary as I can, because one of the biggest obstacles that we face is that the tools that are most frequently used to initiate the consumption of media in our society today are the most frequently blocked inside the classroom. And I'm talking about social media access. It's obvious, it's easy to imagine the reasons why schools are terrified to enable things like Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram and all the things that students use. But the fact of the matter is, even we these days often use the news feeds that we've curated to check our news in the morning when we wake up and when we have a break during the day. But yet we are teaching students to consume media using media tools that aren't really the dominant first go-to of almost anyone anymore. I mean, things like newspapers and news magazines and televised news shows are things we do when we have the luxury of more time for an in-depth sit-in, but it is not how daily news is consumed. And so we don't have the opportunity to model for and with students how to use their social media feeds for anything other than where's the party tonight, where are we going this weekend, amusement by things that lead to sort of some of the adult media behavior we see. It rewards the creation of content that students learned to consume when they could only use social media for their own 12-year-old entertainment, 15-year-old entertainment. So an obstacle that we face now is this lack of authenticity in how we model media consumption as a starting point. I have taught in places where those filters didn't exist, and where we were able to co-develop with students well-curated lists of reliable sources, helping students see how to test whether those sources were reliable over time before they sort of committed to following them, showing them adult media engagement practices that meet the critical thinking skills that we model in all of the other sources we evaluate in the social studies classroom, and then together co-creating these norms that help students perhaps become more successful adult consumers of mass media through the social media on-ramp. But when we don't have it, students learn social media usage in a sort of Lord of the Flies. There's no government, there's no law, there are no adults here because adults are blocked from engaging with them through those tools over their educational lifetime. And by the time they're adults, their habits of consumption are shaped. And I think a lot of those habits are driving what media content providers are creating these days. They're satisfying the urges of people who learned how to consume media when they were teenagers, and no adults were scaffolding or mentoring their experience in those spaces.
Great.
Jay,
Anybody
if I
else?
may,
Yeah, Wesley.
yeah. So, I would start with kind of connecting back to the question about museums and using museums resources first. Databases and high quality sources certainly are a great place to show students what it means to be peer reviewed and what it means to be a high quality source. Looking at media reliability graphics, where it will place the variety of media outlets on a graph, and based on its leanings politically and also its reliability. We have discussions about that. Talk about the differences between an online news organization and their print version. How one might be more sensational than another. We talk about news versus opinion, right? And being able to discern what you're looking at. Sam Weinberg at Stanford first introduced me to the horizontal research. So when students come up with or find a source that they don't know about, they've never heard of, and maybe I haven't either, Sam encouraged us to open up all many tabs and look up that organization. What are others saying about it? As Shannon mentioned, unfortunately, some of those things would be blocked. However, that's a great place for them to start, and certainly they can pick that up when they get home, maybe when they're off of the block at school. But again, that idea of horizontal research and really vetting deeply your sources that you're unsure of.
Excellent. Thank you. One other question that I think is really relevant, and Dr. Rand, your conversation about museums and access to museums and the importance there. We earlier in the session we talked about the importance of these co-curricular activities. Wesley talked about capstone projects and their importance in terms of pulling things together. We know that some schools and some communities are going to have more access to the ability to do those kinds of activities than others. There are going to be some communities where museums don't exist, or where low income, low resource schools have difficulty getting their students to those activities, or offering the kind of expansive curriculum that was idealized earlier in the conversation. How do we just keep this civics ed reinvention from being another source of inequity in our society?
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because I had it in my notes to discuss when we were talking about museums, and then I got all excited about spaces that I love and know. But I think it's absolutely essential that we imagine this not only as a place that works next to the Smithsonian or next to Crystal Bridges, but that can work in an inner city school where there's nothing, where the learning is walking out on the street, and where you can tell the layers of American history just by walking around the block. And how do you see? How do you make walls talk? This is something, there are a lot of place-based learning experts and actually museum educators that have been a part of helping with this. There's amazing work that's been done also in the Netherlands about this kind of stuff. How do you help kids make streets talk? Whatever's on them, the trees, the stones, what's this built out of? Where's this come from, right? You can make a whole history project just on a block Why, just analyzing the space that you have, celebrating your local park, looking at one little thing. There's something that you're going to walk to, right? Any school is going to be somewhere, or even just the school building, right? So it doesn't have to be something that is connected to a museum. You can make your school a museum. Right. And there's usually archives in a school, like stuff. If it's an old school, it's 100 years old, they usually have stuff in the basement. Pull it out, right? Make a museum. This is something, interview your family members, go to the supermarket, oral history. Amazing work is being done in communities across the country, partially supported by museums and local archives and local libraries, right? That have been experimenting with a lot of this stuff. All that is ready to go, right? You can take off the shelf ideas for how to do these kind of oral history projects that you can do zero budget, low cost, no cost, and make it come to life wherever you are, even if you have nothing. If the only thing you have is a couple of people in your apartment building, that's a great start. We can weave a huge tapestry out of what we can find in a housing project. And it's been done. We had one amazing project in one region of Kansas City where they didn't have any museums. They did a whole project in a coffee shop. It was the first Black-owned coffee shop in that part of the city. And one of the teacher's cousin had just set this. I was like, look, I can't get anywhere else, but this is my cousin and her coffee shop. And she's a coffee shop with a bookstore, and she needs some marketing on it. So we're going to do a project about Black coffee, the story of coffee and Blackness and whatever. And then we're going to do research on the history of coffee in America and the history of coffee in Kansas City. We're going to make an exhibit in the coffee shop, and the kids are going to read books in the book. It's going to be a marketing campaign. They're going to do an Instagram. It was this whole community project that this teacher designed with nothing, but they made a museum in the coffee shop. They did, stories, oral stories with people in the coffee shop about where they come from, where they live, and whatever. And it was amazing. And that's like sort of a little bit of a museum of me, a museum of us. That is, again, it cost $0 and was just out of the stuff they found. You can make an exhibit out of trash. And it just out of paper that's recycled. You don't need anything to really make this work. So I think critical in this conversation is making sure that that is at the focus, and at the same time we find opportunities for kids from those neighborhoods that are far away from a museum to claim their city. Like in Boston is an insanely segregated town, right, where I live, and there are kids in the part of town where I live, they've never been downtown. And it's crazy. The statistics of the mobility in big urban districts is depressing. They just don't get the chance to go places, let alone feel like it's theirs. And there was a huge, I don't know whether you followed this at the MFA, a huge crisis of the city when kids did show up at some point. And there was a lady who looks like me doing the tour, and she didn't know how to deal. And it became this massive, awful experience for the kids that felt like this was not their space. And that kind of thing still happens, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen, and yet that we make the most out of the spaces. So it's both, it's everything at the same time, right?
Indeed. We're running close on time, but Justin, do you want to, did you?
Yeah, I did want to say just one thing about this. I know we're running short on time. But this is a really important phenomenon. There's your scholarship on this front by a wonderful person called Mayra Levinson, who has spoken about something called the civic empowerment gap. And one of the things that she does is, document how folks in schools in the city often have a lot less sort of civic education in the form of school newspapers and all of these other things. And what's so important about her work is that she demonstrates how this can have downstream consequences, right? Where some of the problems that exist in our society can be traced to the way that we have done an inadequate job of equipping our poor and marginalized people from being able to stand up for themselves. So when there is some sort of, toxic event that is being moved upon your neighborhood, the levers of power that you can draw upon, because that toxic dump is not going to be in a wealthy neighborhood. And it's because the wealthy have had the benefit of having civic education. So this is just to repeat what I said before, which is that the lessons that people take and learn in school, they're going to take with them for the rest of their lives. And if they don't acquire that knowledge in school, they are going to be ill-equipped from being able to stand up for themselves in our democracy.
Shannon, I'm going to give you the last word.
Oh my goodness gracious, the pressure of that. There are so many exciting last words to that have to be said, but I'd like to continue with a theme that Justin just introduced, and that is that everything we've been talking about tonight is even more mission critical in some communities than others. I was in a discussion earlier today, and we were talking about student willingness to register to vote and enter that sort of formal participation in civil society upon graduation. And the numbers were very clear. When students are engaged in democratic practices, and when we talk about civic participation in classes, students are exponentially more likely to express an interest and a feeling of ability to enter that themselves. That it makes a tremendous impact on whether they ever develop the willingness to, as adults, engage in civil participation. It starts in the classroom, and 2 out of 3 white students report that they get that sort of encouragement and support in their classrooms, but only half of students of color report they get the same thing. So everything we've been talking about tonight there, it isn't a universal across the board condition for students, although I would argue that our unwillingness to engage in that sort of authentic civic practices in our social studies classrooms has impacted us on every end of the spectrum and every demographic group. But those communities where students grow up perhaps in most need to learn where those levers of power are, how the institutions of government work, and how they can access them, are the places where educators have been denied the support and the ability to supply that education for their students. And there is nothing less important than the future of the Republic resting on how well we do this and how well we rise to this challenge now. So we are the frontline workers in whatever anyone is afraid of right now as far as the health and sustainability of our democracy. And it starts in our classrooms. And so I just can't imagine any work more important to be engaged in right now. And I'm so excited to have spent the evening with people who are so passionate and able to bring these important conversations forward. So thanks for giving me that last word.
Awesome. Fantastic, Shannon. You said it incredibly well. And I just want to thank all 4 of our guests tonight for their commitment to these issues and for a truly great and very civil conversation this evening. And Rachel, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Well, I'm just here to thank each and every one of you for sharing your wonderful insights tonight. And thank you everyone for being here on behalf of Crystal Bridges. And thanks to our partner, the Clinton Presidential Library.
Awesome.
Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.